What if you could walk into a pharmacy, prick your finger, and know within minutes whether you had cancer? What if a single drop of blood, not a vial, not a needle, not a hospital visit, could tell you everything your body was trying to say? What if the technology that had kept medical testing expensive, slow, and inaccessible for a century was simply unnecessary? What if one person, working from a rented office in Palo Alto, had figured out a way to make it obsolete? That was the promise. And for more than a decade, millions of people believed it. Some of the most powerful figures in American public life believed it. Former Secretaries of State believed it. Generals believed it. The media celebrated it. Walgreens built its business model around it. Patients trusted it with their lives. The promise turned out to be a lie. But the empire built on that promise was, for a time, real. And the story of how that empire was built, who believed, who doubted, who was silenced, and what it cost the people at the bottom of it, is one of the most extraordinary stories that Silicon Valley has ever produced. Not because of the fraud, but because of what came before it. Before we go any further into this story, a story that will make you question everything you think you know about how ambition, charisma, and the fear of asking the wrong question can build an empire out of nothing. Make sure you are subscribed to the Archives Untold channel. Leave us a comment and tell us which other corporate stories you want us to investigate. Because what you are about to hear is not just the story of a fraud. It is a story about belief, about the extraordinary power of a single person to make the world see what they need it to see. In 2002, an 18-year-old named Elizabeth Holmes enrolled at Stanford University to study chemical engineering. She had been obsessed with science since childhood. She had already taught herself Mandarin. She had already started a small business selling software. She arrived at Stanford the way some people arrive at the places where their lives will change, absolutely certain that she was supposed to be there, and absolutely uncertain how that certainty would manifest. It manifested quickly. During a summer internship at the Genome Institute of Singapore in 2002, Holmes worked on technology to test for the SARS virus. She came back to Stanford with an idea, not a fully formed idea, more like a conviction, a direction, an itch that wouldn't leave her alone. What if you could take all the diagnostic power of a modern blood testing lab and compress it into something portable? Something that didn't require a needle. Something that worked from a single drop of blood from the tip of a finger, producing results in minutes rather than days. She took the idea to Phyllis Gardner, a professor of medicine at Stanford. Gardner was direct. The idea, as Holmes had described it, could not work. The science did not support it. Gardner told her so. Holmes thanked her and left, and went to find someone else. That someone else was Channing Robertson, a professor of chemical engineering, a dean, one of the most respected figures in his field at Stanford. Robertson had a reputation for identifying extraordinary students. He had never met one quite like this. Holmes was not brilliant in the conventional academic sense, at least not yet, but she had something harder to teach and easier to underestimate, an absolute, unshakable belief that she was right and that everyone who told her otherwise was simply lacking the imagination to see what she could see. Robertson was captivated. He let her work in his lab. He became her mentor. He would later say, and this quote deserves to be held, that he looked into her eyes and saw something that made him think of Bill Gates, of Steve Jobs. You start to realize you are looking in the eyes of another Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. Channing Robertson, Stanford professor, speaking of Elizabeth Holmes. After that assessment, Holmes began to dress like Jobs. In 2003, 19 years old and in her sophomore year, Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford. She used the money her parents had saved for her education as seed funding. She named her company Theranos, a portmanteau of therapy and diagnosis, and she began to build. What Elizabeth Holmes built between 2003 and 2014 was, by any external measure, an extraordinary achievement. Not in the laboratory, that part would come apart later, but in the architecture of credibility, in the construction of an institution that looked to almost every eye exactly like the real thing. The first money came from Tim Draper, a venture capitalist who was also a family friend. $1 million. Holmes was 20 years old. By the end of 2004, she had raised $6 million. By the end of 2010, $92 million. And then, in 2011, the trajectory changed. In July 2011, Holmes was introduced to George Shultz, not a venture capitalist, not a technology investor. George Shultz, who had been the United States Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, who had been Secretary of the Treasury under Richard Nixon, who was one of the most connected men in Washington, D.C., and had been for half a century. The meeting lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, Shultz joined the Theranos board. What followed was one of the most remarkable sequences in the history of corporate board formation. Over the next 3 years, Shultz introduced Holmes to almost every prominent figure in his network. The Theranos board became, in the words of one analysis at the time, the most illustrious in American corporate history. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense; Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State; Sam Nunn, former senator and one of the most respected voices in American national security; Bill Frist, former Senate Majority Leader and heart transplant surgeon; General Jim Mattis, one of the most respected military commanders in the country, later Secretary of Defense under President Trump; Riley Bechtel, chairman of the Bechtel Group, one of the largest engineering firms in the world. Not one of them was a scientist. Not one was a medical doctor. Not one had the specific technical expertise that would have allowed them to evaluate whether what Holmes was claiming was scientifically possible. But all of them were exactly the kind of people whose presence on a board communicates without a single word of explanation. This is real. This matters. This can be trusted. The investment community took the same signal. Rupert Murdoch put in more than $120 million. The Walton family, the founders of Walmart, invested $150 million. Betsy DeVos contributed $100 million. By the time investors were done, Theranos had raised more than $700 million from some of the wealthiest and most sophisticated people in the world. None of them had been allowed to perform meaningful due diligence. Holmes kept the technology secret. She kept the science secret. She kept the results secret. She justified the secrecy through the language of competitive advantage. Apple didn't show competitors its source code, so why should Theranos show competitors its methods? And the investors, each of whom had seen the board, each of whom had heard the vision, each of whom was looking at a company valued at $9 billion, accepted the explanation. This is what happens when you work to change things. First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world. Elizabeth Holmes on CNBC, October 2015. In the public eye, Holmes was not merely a CEO, she was a phenomenon. She appeared on the covers of Fortune, Forbes, and Inc. She was named the youngest self-made female billionaire in the United States. Time magazine placed her on its list of the 100 most influential people in the world. She gave a TED Talk. She spoke at the Aspen Institute. she was invited to the World Economic Forum in Davos, and she looked the part with a precision that, in retrospect, tells you everything. The black turtleneck, Jobs' signature, worn so consistently it became her own. The voice, lowered deliberately to a baritone register that she believed would command more authority in rooms full of men. The intense, unblinking eye contact. The language of mission and democratization and changing the world that Silicon Valley had perfected, and that she had studied and absorbed and deployed with the skill of someone who understood, at a level almost nobody noticed, that the story of a company and the company itself were not the same thing. Partnerships followed. In 2012, Safeway invested $350 million retrofitting 800 of its stores with Theranos clinics. In 2013, Theranos opened 40 wellness centers inside Walgreens pharmacies across Arizona. By the time Elizabeth Holmes was 29 years old, Theranos had processed more than 1 million blood tests for nearly 176,000 patients. They were real patients, with real health decisions to make, trusting real results. The results were not real. Inside Theranos, a different story was being told. The Edison device, the proprietary blood testing machine at the center of everything Holmes had promised, did not work as described. It could not run the full range of tests Holmes claimed. The results it produced were inconsistent, unreliable, and in some cases, dangerously wrong. Patients with normal health markers were told they might have serious conditions. Patients with serious conditions received results that provided false reassurance. The company knew. Not every employee, many joined Theranos in genuine faith, drawn by the vision Holmes had described so compellingly. But at the senior level, in the laboratory, among the scientists who worked closest to the technology, the knowledge was there, and it was managed with a system of secrecy and pressure that the bankruptcy examiner and later the federal prosecutors would document in extraordinary detail. Holmes had built her culture on the model of Apple: absolute secrecy, intense loyalty, and a burning sense of mission that made ordinary ethical doubts feel like a failure of imagination. Employees signed aggressive, non-disclosure agreements. Different departments were kept deliberately siloed so that no single employee could assemble a complete picture of what the company was and was not able to do. Those who raised concerns were told they were insufficiently committed to the mission. Those who persisted were let go. And behind everything, in a role that had been kept almost entirely hidden from the outside world, was a man named Ramesh Balwani. Holmes had met Balwani when she was 18, and he was 37. He was married to another woman at the time. By 2003, the year she dropped out of Stanford and founded Theranos, they were romantically involved. Balwani had made money in the dot-com era selling a software company. He had no scientific background, no medical credentials, no expertise in diagnostics or blood testing. In 2009, Holmes installed him as president and chief operating officer of Theranos. Their relationship was kept secret from the board, from investors, and from almost everyone outside the company's inner circle. Balwani ran operations with a ferocity that complemented Holmes's vision. Where she faced outward, presenting the dream to the world, he managed the reality of what was happening inside. When employees raised concerns about test accuracy, it was often Balwani they faced. When people asked questions that were not welcome, it was Balwani who made clear the consequences. The man who might have asked the questions that mattered most died in May 2013. His name was Ian Gibbons. He was Theranos's chief scientist, one of the very few people in the company with the genuine expertise to assess whether what Holmes was claiming was scientifically achievable. Gibbons had been hired in 2005 and had spent years navigating the growing gap between what Holmes told the outside world and what the technology could actually do. He had been subpoenaed in a patent lawsuit and feared what his testimony might require him to say. Gibbons took his own life. He was 67 years old. Holmes did not attend his funeral. Instead, the company contacted his widow to request the return of corporate documents. That detail is not a metaphor. It is not an interpretation. It is simply what happened, and it tells you, perhaps more precisely than any financial figure or legal finding, what Theranos had become by the time the outside world was still printing Elizabeth Holmes's face on magazine covers. The empire did not fall because regulators noticed. It did not fall because investors asked the right questions. It did not fall because the board, with 2 former Secretaries of State and a future Secretary of Defense among its members, exercised the oversight that governance requires. It fell because of a handful of young employees who couldn't stop seeing what they saw. Tyler Schultz was 22 years old when he joined Theranos in 2013, fresh from a Stanford biology degree. He was also the grandson of George Schultz, the man who had done more than anyone else to give Theranos its credibility. Tyler had joined the company believing in what Holmes had described. What he found in the laboratory destroyed that belief within months. He saw test results being erased. He saw machines being run on patient samples that produced results the operators knew were unreliable. He tried to raise his concerns internally to Holmes herself, and was told, in language that was calm and absolute, that he was wrong about what he had seen. He then went to the New York State Department of Health, filing a complaint under a false name. Theranos found out. The company deployed lawyers and investigators. They confronted Tyler Schultz on a sidewalk outside his grandfather's house. They made clear to him, with considerable precision, what the cost of continuing to speak would be. Legal bills alone, they implied, could be ruinous. Tyler Schultz hired his own lawyer and did not stop. Erica Chung was another young laboratory employee who spent 6 months at Theranos in 2013 and 2014 before resigning because of what she witnessed. She tried to raise concerns internally. She was questioned about her own competence. She resigned. Theranos then hired private investigators who followed her. She changed her residence multiple times. She acquired a prepaid phone so her calls could not be monitored. Chung went to federal regulators anyway. And then there was John Carreyrou. Carreyrou was an investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal who had spent more than a year following the Theranos story by the time his first article appeared in October 2015. He had sources inside the company. He had documents. He had spoken to former employees who had watched the gap between Holmes's public claims and the company's actual capabilities grow wider every year. His article stated the central fact plainly. Theranos was not using its own Edison machines to run most of its tests. Instead, the company was using conventional laboratory equipment, the same machines used by every other blood testing lab in the country, and presenting the results as though they had been produced by Theranos's proprietary technology. The revolutionary product at the center of the $9 billion valuation was in practice not being used for the vast majority of the company's work. Holmes went on television the same evening the article was published. She appeared on CNBC's Mad Money, where Jim Cramer called the article brutal. Holmes replied, "This is what happens when you work to change things. First, they think you're crazy. Then they fight you, and then all of a sudden, you change the world." Elizabeth Holmes, CNBC's Mad Money, October 15th, 2015. She deployed the language of the visionary, being persecuted by the conventional. She had used that language for years. It was part of the architecture of the empire, a ready answer to any question about why the science had never been published, why the technology had never been independently validated, why the company operated with a secrecy that its most credentialed board members had never thought to challenge. But this time, something was different. This time, there were documents, there were sources, there was a journalist who would not stop. The same month Carreyrou's article was published, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services sent inspectors to Theranos' laboratory in Newark, California. What they found was described, in the formal regulatory language of a government report, as posing immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. The empire had one more act to perform, and it was perhaps the most extraordinary thing of all. When Vice President Joe Biden visited the Theranos facility in Palo Alto to tour the laboratory, Holmes and Balwani had built him a fake one. The actual laboratory, the one the government inspectors would later flag as a patient safety hazard, was hidden. What Biden saw was a staged environment, designed specifically for his visit, presenting an image of competence and order that had no connection to the company's real operations. Biden praised what he saw. He called Holmes an inspiration. He had been shown a set. The collapse of Theranos moved quickly once the walls began to fall. In 2016, Walgreens closed all 40 of its Theranos wellness centers. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services banned Holmes from the laboratory testing industry for 2 years and moved to revoke the company's laboratory certification. Theranos voided 2 years of Edison test results, more than 779,000 tests, because they could no longer be trusted. Think about what that means. 779,000 tests, each one representing a real person who had made a real decision or watched a doctor make a real decision based on a result that had just been declared unreliable. In 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Holmes and Theranos with fraud, alleging that they had raised more than $700 million through false and misleading statements about the company's technology, business, and finances. Holmes settled without admitting wrongdoing. The same year, a federal grand jury indicted both Holmes and Balwani on criminal charges. Theranos dissolved in September 2018, announcing it would use its remaining cash to pay creditors. The criminal trials were extraordinary in their own right. Holmes took the stand in her own defense, a decision that almost no white-collar fraud defendant ever makes. She told the court that she had genuinely believed in what she was doing, that the failures of the technology were not fraud, but the ordinary setbacks of an ambitious company working at the frontier of science. She also told the court that Balwani had psychologically and emotionally controlled her during their relationship, that he had dictated what she ate, how she dressed, who she could speak to. The jury heard all of it. On January 3rd, 2022, they found her guilty on 4 counts of fraud related to investors. They acquitted her on counts related to defrauding patients. Balwani, tried separately, was found guilty on all 12 counts. On November 18th, 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Sunny Balwani received 12 years and 11 months. Together, they were ordered to pay $452 million in restitution. On the day of Holmes's sentencing, a man stood up in the courtroom and spoke without being prepared. His name was Alex Schultz. He was the son of George Schultz, whose board membership had given Theranos its credibility and whose grandson Tyler had risked everything to expose what the company was. Alex Schultz looked at Holmes and said, in halting, improvised words, that she had taken advantage of his father, that she had figured out his weakness, that the damage to his family, to his father's reputation, to his son's safety, was real and permanent. The Theranos story is usually told as the story of a liar, of a person who constructed a false identity and a false product and deceived the world with it. But that framing misses the part that keeps it relevant long after the sentencing. Because Elizabeth Holmes did not build her empire by lying to the powerful. She built it by telling the powerful exactly what they wanted to hear. And they wanted to hear it so badly, the venture capitalists who prided themselves on finding the next jobs, the statesmen who wanted to believe that American innovation could solve the problems that politics had failed to solve, the media that was hungry for the story of a young woman disrupting a complacent industry, that they suspended collectively the ordinary habits of scrutiny that their own fields demanded. The scientists who might have asked the hard questions were not in the room. The board had no one who understood what it would actually take to run 100 simultaneous blood tests on a single drop from a fingertip. The investors performed no independent technical verification. The regulatory frameworks that should have caught the problem were not designed for a company that moved with the speed Theranos moved. And meanwhile, the patients, the people at the bottom of the empire, who were never part of the story of ambition and disruption, and the next Steve Jobs, were receiving results that some of them used to make decisions about their health. Theranos did not fail because Silicon Valley produced a liar. Silicon Valley has always produced liars. Theranos happened because an entire culture, in its hunger for the next transformation, forgot to ask the question that every single innovation in medicine requires before it touches a human being. Does it work? Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story left you asking questions about Silicon Valley, about who we choose to believe, and about the cost of collective excitement, then subscribe to the Archives Untold channel. Every week we find the stories the official version prefers to skip. Leave us a comment. Tell us which company's hidden history we should investigate next. See you in the next video.